And I just got the live streaming notification.
Yeah, it's up. It's running. Let's just make sure it's on the right channel. It is. All right. You guys are
Got it.
ready. Whenever you want to get going, if you want to give let Robert give his spiel or however you want to proceed.
Let's do it, Robert. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Barbara. Welcome. If this is your first time joining us virtually, you will notice that you are currently muted, and everyone will remain muted throughout the meeting, except the committee co-chairs, Barbara, Sahar, and Addison, and any presenters as we move through the agenda. Following the presentation, the co-chairs will call on members of the public who wish to speak. You can participate by going to the reactions icon on your device and pressing the raise hand button, not the wave or the thumbs up, as those will disappear. Only press it once. If you press it a second time, your hand will go back down. If you're calling in on the phone, it is *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute. Please be on the lookout for a prompt asking you to confirm unmuting once one of the coaches calls on you. The chat is available for technical support only to help with Zoom software problems, not to ask questions of the co-chairs or the presenter. They will not see these chats. If you're using an older version of Zoom, you need to go to the participants section, where you find the raise hand feature there. Please do not raise your actual hand or wave at the screen because we may not be able to see you. Chat me, I'm here for support. Barbara, Sahara, Addison, back.
Oh, mine. Okay, I will get started. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and a special thank you for Will and Robert, who helped um, bring our wonderful speaker to us. Helen Chinani is a project manager. Let me read this correctly at um, the mayor's office. Where do I have this? The mayor's office of the climate and environmental justice. These are very big words, and she's going to discuss Plan NYC, which has been in the news so much, as well as other initiatives. I don't know if you're going to get to the city of Yes, Helen, but I read both, and it's been extremely interesting. And I will say, as a sideline, what I'm hoping to do is what we're hoping to do, Addison and Sahara and I, are to work with other committees and specific things. For instance, greening may have to do with parks and transportation. There's so much on transportation and so much dealing with small business and so on. So we're so eager to hear what you have to say, Helen, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And I'll say there are a couple of, I'm going to focus on the Plan YC framework, which touches on a lot of cross-sector, cross-agency issues. There are a few initiatives that do connect back to City of Yes, but that's, another robust conversation. And so I'd be happy to put you in touch with the city planning department. I've seen they do a really wonderful overview presentation because there are a lot of different initiatives and layers baked into that. So
great. That would be another meeting. That would be great. Thank you.
Exactly. Okay, so why don't I go ahead and share this presentation? All right, so everybody's able to see this now?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. Helen Shinani, Policy Advisor at the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. It is indeed a mouthful. We go by MOCEJ as, to keep it a bit shorter. And if you're not familiar with us, we are an office within the Mayor's Office, obviously, and our focus is on equity and public health as we advance the city's policies, programs, and strategies to confront the climate crisis. Really thinking about near and short-term impacts to provide benefits to New Yorkers today and ensuring that we're enabling future generations to thrive as well. Okay, so this presentation could really be as long or short as we'd like it to be. There's a lot covered within the plan, and I can drop in the link into the chat at some point when I can figure out how to navigate that. But everything that I'll cover today is essentially contained within the Plan YC report. So you can view that PDF on our website, climate.nyc.gov, if you want to dig any deeper into any of these topics. But also, happy to try to answer as many questions as I can while I'm here today.
Thank you.
So how familiar are folks with Plan YC at large? This is an initiative that's goes back to 2007 under the Bloomberg administration. So 5 iterations of it to date. So are folks relatively familiar?
I will tell you my answer is I remember going to the meetings under the Bloomberg administration.
Okay.
But it was more after Sandy, am I right? It was more about flood control, and I think it's quite different today. Am I right?
That's correct. So yeah, we've gone through a number of, eras, periods of evolution with these plans. So under Bloomberg, it was really the first time that we as a city acknowledged the importance and began to plan for a sustainable and resilient future. It was actually under the de Blasio administration that Plan YC became retitled as One NYC and really kind of grew to become much more expansive than what was actually required under the law. So, sorry to back up, publishing Plan YC is actually required under local law. Even though it goes back to 2007, it didn't become mandated until 2013. So every 4 years, April 22nd, so that's about Earth Day, every 4 years, the city is required to put together this comprehensive plan. It is called out in the law to focus much more specifically on these aspects of our economy, of our environment, public health. And so the initial Plan YC under Bloomberg really looked specifically at those areas, thought strategically about what policies and programs might be needed to advance our goals and achieve our climate objectives. It also established the importance of having accountability by establishing metrics for tracking progress with a requirement for progress report every year, also in April. And also importantly, includes requirements to look at, future-looking data, initially population projections, and now we are, very thankfully incorporating data from the New York City Panel on Climate Change and really incorporating a science-backed focus on our planning and the actions that we're taking. So, coming back to this evolution under de Blasio, it really kind of ballooned to encompass many other topics like democratic processes and education, things that were much broader than the initial scope of the law. But it importantly was the first time that it really we started to think about resiliency. So in response to Sandy, and also began to talk about the importance of equity. So, when the first report was released, it was really about planning for the future. But 16 years later, enough with the planning, it's really time for implementation. And so that's what the Adams administration's Plan YC is really about, focusing much more specifically on tangible actions to put into practice items that we've already committed to. We've had 16 years of policy development. So there are things in place now like Local Law 97, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So one of the main principles of this report is to implement things that we've already committed to, right? We also really want to lead by example as a city. So there are not a lot of initiatives that deal with what we can do with city-owned infrastructure, programs that can help stimulate workforce development, provide support for the private sector to innovate, but really also trying to provide proof of concept, right, and help to scale up solutions by being, the first to go and prove those concepts out. We also really want to make sure that we're centering environmental justice in all of the work that we're doing. And as I go through the initiatives, you'll see some examples of where that's really, a primary focus, but really wanting to make sure that we're taking that approach across the board with all of our work. We, as I mentioned, are going to need support beyond the city. So beyond involving the private sector, we are really working on leveraging support through federal and state funding. This is really important right now in the context of city budget cuts that we're facing in light of the migrant crisis. And there is unprecedented, once in a generation funding available right now through the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law for climate action initiatives and infrastructure. So a big focus of the work that we're doing across agencies is to advocate for and apply for as much of that money as we can to really get projects in the ground. Let's see, so climate budgeting. We are also one of the first cities, very excited to have announced this in Plan YC, but one of the first cities in the world to implement a climate budgeting process. And so this will be rolling out over the next year. Eventually, after I think about a year of sort of working through the nuances of how this will be put into effect, the idea is that all budgeting for any city new needs requests will be evaluated through the lens of their climate impact. So are the dollars we're investing as a city locking us in to poor decisions in infrastructure that move us away from our climate resilience, environmental justice goals, or are we making an impact, by essentially voting with our dollar? And then, making sure that all of this work we're doing is providing opportunities for economic mobility, well-paying green economy jobs. And again, making sure that we're providing those resources, particularly in the most historically disinvested communities. And so part of the initiatives and the framework of Plan YC came not only from a truly enormous cross-agency, all of government, long coordinating planning approach, but making sure that we involved stakeholders. So across multiple sectors, we held roundtables with an advisory board of experts. We incorporated data from NYC Speaks, and then some of the key takeaways are really reflected, I think, in those 9 key principles, which I just covered. So for those of you who have not read Plan YC cover to cover yet, it has 3 main chapters that are 3 main goal areas, actually broken into about 10 chapters based on these key priority areas. So under protecting us from climate threats, looking at threats from extreme heat, flooding both from precipitation and from sea level rise, tidal inundation, coastal storm surge, looking at both, the threats from our building emissions, as well as opportunities there, opportunities to accelerate and scale up clean energy development. Quality of life looks at opportunities for improving the health of and expanding our green spaces, similarly restoring and protecting waterways, looking at opportunities to shift to more sustainable modes of transit and electrify where we need to, use vehicles, whether private or public or freight. And then also looking at opportunities to develop the regional food production economy, make sure that we're providing nutritious, culturally relevant food, and also for the first time looking at consumption-based emissions. So you may or may not be aware, the city has been tracking for about 10 years a greenhouse gas inventory. So that looks at stationary emissions, which are essentially from our buildings, as well as mobile sources, so really transportation. But for the first time as of this year, we're looking at the items we consume. And so tracking emissions from food, both public and private, is a big piece of that. And then, as I mentioned, we really want to make sure that all of the investments, all of the work that we're putting into advancing these climate action goals are providing benefits to New Yorkers, helping to grow the local economy, that we're moving towards also a circular economy where we're being much more aware of, cradle to grave implementation implications of where things go when we're done with them. And
I'm sorry.
Yep. Was there a question?
No, I'm sorry. Like,
all right, I'll keep going then.
Sorry about that.
But really seeing this as an opportunity to build the economy of the future and make sure that those benefits are distributed equitably across the city. So there are a lot of initiative areas, and believe it or not, so these are, as I go across the three main goal areas that, were just covered on the previous slide, there are, across those 32 of these initiative areas, but under each of these are actually nested much more concrete, more discrete actions. And so, again, I encourage you to look at the report itself if you want more details on each of these. I'm just going to hit on a couple of highlights since we could be here all day if we went through each of these. So extreme heat is one of the biggest threats. We just saw a beautiful day on Saturday, but unseasonably warm. One of the biggest threats that New Yorkers face, about 350 New Yorkers die every year from extreme heat related deaths. And so we really are prioritizing ways to address heat vulnerability, particularly for some of the most vulnerable populations. So one key initiative is maximizing access to indoor cooling, which includes this proposal or developing legislature, which is actually beginning to gain traction within the city council, but passing legislation to establish a maximum indoor temperature by 2030. And so this would sort of be a corollary to the way that we have winter heating season requirements, right? So making sure that nobody in their apartments is exposed to, unhealthy, highly risky levels of heat. Additionally, another item that is also gaining traction in City Council is to pass mandatory cooling requirements for new construction. And this is something that fortunately dovetails, I think, pretty nicely with Local Law 97 requirements. So particularly for new construction, a lot of new buildings being built are already providing cooling. It's expected more and more. And with Local Law 97 requirements to decarbonize and keep emissions below a certain level, this is really an opportunity for us to advance getting high efficiency heat pumps and electrification technology out there, which can provide both heating and cooling so all residents have both. And then also in the short term, we're advocating for reforms to HEAP, which is a federally funded state administered program. And this provides utility bill assistance for low income individuals, but it historically has not provided funding support for purchasing equipment. And so this is a mechanism by which we could help to subsidize the cost of cooling equipment where, it might not be provided by a developer. And we're also engaging with community-based organizations and environmental justice organizations to advance that work. I'll just mention, just to touch back on the tree canopy. I think this is an issue that's near and dear to a lot of people's hearts. So Plan YC sets out a commitment to achieve this 30% tree canopy coverage citywide. We're already actually, I think, about halfway there. We've had some recent wins actually passing through the city council, 2 new pieces of legislation. So about half of the city's trees are in public right of way and parks. And so the parks has a lot of great initiatives this year. I think it was record numbers for their tree planting initiatives. We've also, under Plan YC, gotten funding, although with the current funding crises, there's a little bit of, a hiccup there, but increasing funding for a tree pruner training program to increase the number of parks employees that can do tree maintenance, making sure that the trees we plant continue to be healthy and grow big enough to provide that coverage. But the legislative wins are to ensure that, to basically enshrine this commitment into all future Plan YCs. So under the law, we saw on that first slide, there were a few topic areas that were required. Tree coverage was not one of them. And, with political whims in the future, this could potentially be taken out, but it is now enshrined in the law for all future climate action plans. And the other piece of legislation is a requirement for the city to produce a tree master plan, which will look at not only those public right-of-way parks trees, but also private property, and how together, we really need to consider both of those pieces together if we want to achieve this 30% goal. So, some real frameworks in place there to drive this forward. Okay. Any questions before I move on? I don't know where I put my phone. I just want to keep track of time. Okay, it's already been 25 minutes and there's so much here. So I'll try to go a little bit more quickly. And maybe can come back to some items if folks have more questions. So I know that, flood risk is certainly something that your district faces and knows well. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the East Side Coastal Resilience Project, with the miles of flood protection and sea gates that have been put in thus far. So, that's part of a bigger project where we're looking at other parts of Lower Manhattan, as well as other boroughs, areas like Red Hook, Coney Island. There are a number of major resilience infrastructure projects that are in sort of various stages of development. But this also includes creating some standards to make sure that, again, similar to climate budgeting, making sure that the decisions we make today when we're going to put in infrastructure are really being built to those future climate risks, data-backed risks. So developing resilient standards for shoreline assets, working with the U.S. Army Corps for this New York, New Jersey harbor and tributaries study. So that's looking more broadly at the New York harbor, at more large-scale infrastructure options. So sort of neighborhood level, large-scale infrastructure, what might make the most sense where. So that's a process that we're currently working through in collaboration with a few different entities. Developing this stormwater flooding adaptation plan. There's already a lot of work that's underway to address stormwater risk, but making sure that it's really codified in a clear way. And then also integrating blue-green infrastructure, things like bioswales, rain garden, blue belt areas, living shorelines. And we also are breaking ground on a number of cloudburst projects, which include both kind of gray or traditional drainage infrastructure in creative ways with green infrastructure to look at, looking at data, what are some of the hotspots across the city that experience the worst chronic flooding, so we can prioritize where we're investing and learn some key lessons, right, for how to scale up those solutions, but really starting where we see the highest risk and the highest need. Hot topic, and Robert had mentioned that you had at some point had a local law 97 presentation, so I won't belabor this.
We've had a couple of meetings on it.
Okay. So in September, Department of Buildings did put out the updated rules for that. So we actually have on our website a report getting local law 97 done, as Mayor Adams likes to frame everything as getting stuff done. So we have a report on there, and it provides a bit more detail on some of the creative financing mechanisms like PACE financing, incentives that we're trying to coordinate with utilities, NYSERDA, at the state level, to make sure we can support building owners in doing the work they need to do. We don't want their money, we want the carbon, right? We don't want folks to face penalties. So making sure that people have the support they need to achieve our decarbonization goals. And then similarly, making sure that we're growing the workforce to get all this done, because there's going to be a huge market for all this work, right? So a big opportunity to upskill existing workers in the building industry and also train the next generation. Okay, so again, just making sure that where folks may not have as many resources to take on building upgrades, but particularly looking not only at the private sector, but the public sector and our affordable housing stock, both through NYCHA and HPD, committing to make some significant advancements there. So we have this commitment to install 10,000 heat pumps and 10,000 units. That's actually 30,000 heat pumps total. So you might see that number in a few different places. And over the summer, we conducted a really cool pilot program. I forget the name of the technology provider, but the city, NYCHA, worked with them to actually engineer a custom heat pump that sort of slots into where existing window AC sleeves have been in NYCHA units. So kind of an easy plug and play piece of equipment that didn't exist before. So that's a very exciting development. Funding is always a challenge, but really working to try to secure additional funding to be able to roll that out citywide. And then, making sure that we're also able to increase access not only to utility scale renewables like large scale solar, wind. We're looking at hydropower from Canada, but making sure that we're also investing in local distributed energy resources, which provides resilient benefits, but also programs like public solar enable community members to buy in and invest in these systems. And there's some interesting models that show that it can really be a mechanism for community wealth generation. And so we'll be rolling out a pilot program for this, looking at siting public, both on private properties, but also city-owned buildings like schools and other institutions. So, okay, I think that I had the most in that section because it really covers a wide range. Oh, and here is where the City of Yes text amendment does include some some proposals that would hopefully kind of cut through some of the barriers that have historically made it difficult for even the people who are willing and interested in putting solar on their properties or, buying into a program like this. We're really trying to identify what are those roadblocks, and, cut through that red tape, and then also access state funding, tax abatements, et cetera, where we can to try to, accelerate this development. Okay, so then to go through this a bit more quickly. So for green space, we have this commitment to expanding access to making sure that nobody, no matter where they are across the city, is within about a 10-minute walk to green space and to safe corridors to get, if not to an immediately adjacent green area, but to travel between them and expand that. Also, a lot of this waterway work, I think, kind of retreads a lot of what I touched upon with flooding, but also integrating sustainable modes of transit. This is a big part, obviously, about decreasing levels of emissions, improving local air quality, but also, just promoting public health, making sure we have more vibrant streetscapes as well. So I'll just touch on those couple, but happy to go back if there are other things on here that catch your eye. So excited to announce that I think it was just about a week or two ago, but Mayor Adams announced that we're moving forward, Parks is moving forward with expanding 5 greenway corridors supported by a federal DOT grant. So really making a lot of good progress to achieve this goal. And then, as I mentioned with parks, they're really thinking about how can they steward, protect our green spaces and provide opportunities to create jobs and encourage stewardship of, everyday New Yorkers as part of that process. So with our public transit goals, yes, Alita, I see a question.
Hi, thank you very much for allowing me to speak at this moment. This just has to do with green space. Are there any plans to increase green space by acquiring land and turning it into parks because the Upper East Side is so congested? And the other thing is, does green space include community gardens, which in addition to possibly providing food, providing greenery, providing a place of beauty and interest is, sorry that my camera's off, and also there are also eyes on the street. So studies have shown, I think out of Columbia, that when there are public gardens, crime in the street decreases. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great question. So one of the sub initiatives, so of the many details nested within the report, there is a commitment to create over 10 acres of new open space and expand more connections beyond just these miles of trails, just making sure that they're safe routes to get there. And in the report, it does touch on community gardens as a potential solution and one of the, many areas where we might be able to revitalize, abandoned land or just, create more opportunities for community stewardship while also providing those green spaces.
But Helen, I think we would we would love for you to finish, and then I have a million questions. So we'll have questions after. Thank you.
Great. So I think I, already touched on this, but we saw a lot of folks obviously flee from the subway, from using MTA during COVID. We've seen that really begin to bounce back. But as part of our decarbonization goals, we want to get that number up as high as we possibly can. Understanding, however, that there are New Yorkers who need to rely on cars for a number of reasons. We have an enormous amount of freight, lots of deliveries, things like Amazon, right, coming in and out of the city. So need to think creatively. We have another initiative that actually looks more creatively about how can we electrify those vehicles where it's more challenging to get folks to switch away from them. Congestion pricing, I know, is a pretty hot topic. So that's
No,
gone.
not at our community board.
Vision Zero is, a policy that's been around for quite some time. But again, one of the big themes of this plan is just revisiting the commitments that have been made previously, being kind of wide-eyed about where are we in relation to those goals, have accountability around that, and then try to find solutions to really make good on some of those commitments that, where we've already put forth. And actually this, the last bullet point overlaps with the waste, but I know the rat czar is very excited to keep skipping that. Our rat czar is very excited about rolling out waste containerization. And so not only would this make our streets more beautiful, but in, hoping to make a dent in the rat population by actually putting our trash bags in containers as opposed to leaving them out on the sidewalk. This would be for commercial entities and in more dense areas, larger containers. Like you can see some great examples in Europe where they've been doing this for years, individual wheelie bins, but moving that forward in parallel to also expanding our organics collection and reuse program is something that we're very excited about that moving forward as well. We've already really touched on, the importance and emphasis that we're placing on workforce development. Kind of across the board, not only with buildings, but especially in the energy sector, there are going to be a lot of opportunities that we've hit a snag with the Public Service Commission in building out our offshore wind projects, but EDC, the Economic Development Corporation, has launched a major innovation center in Sunset Park. And so that will be a place where there will, hopefully in the near future, be opportunities for to incubate small companies, innovative technologies, and then provide job opportunities for New Yorkers to get, trained up in offshore wind technologies. And then, so lastly, not only are we rolling out containerization, but we've begun the process of rolling out citywide curbside organic. So your part of Manhattan have you gotten
Right.
your brown bins yet? You
Nope.
have? No. Okay. So Brooklyn and Queens have been the first two. So that began a couple of months ago, but we'll be rolling out across all four boroughs by a point in 2024. Don't quote me on what the exact date is for that. And then I'll just mention, sorry, I'm having trouble with this. DEP, I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to see or tour the biodigesters, the DEP wastewater treatment plant off the Newtown Creek. It's very cool. It looks really beautiful, but it's the first facility where we are taking, so when compost is collected by the city or food waste is collected by the city, some of that does go into soil amendments, compost for soil amendments, but we're also now turning that into biogas, which earlier this year, we hit a milestone of being able to integrate that into a natural gas pipeline to then run things like city buses. So just beginning to ramp that up, but really interesting, first step towards, scaling up this alternate source of energy and creating this more circular system of being able to put our waste to use.
Can we arrange a tour?
Yeah, so I can we had done an office tour, and I know that they offer tours to the public, but I can look into that and see who our
Let Will
contact
know.
was.
If that would be great, if you could let Will know.
Yeah.
I believe they also used to do like Valentine's Day tours.
Yes, they do Valentine's Day tours, and they light the digester eggs up with red lights. So, but it's very cool, and you can walk through and get kind of a high level idea of
if
how
you could find out how to do it, we will. Thank you.
Yeah. I can certainly look into that. So, I obviously skipped over quite a number of things, but
I think this was great.
yeah, and then I can drop some links in the chat once I stop sharing my screen.
All I did was say NYC, Plan NYC, and I got the document in the
Perfect.
same
Okay.
so you just Google it and you do get the document.
Great. And then we also put out in September a pretty short document on 97 guidance, and this was based on the second rules package that just came out at the beginning of September. And so that includes additional details about compliance. We also just released, also in September, Power Up NYC, which is the city's first long-term energy plan, also mandated under local law. This is to be updated every 4 years. And we are describing it as sort of a double click on some Plan YC initiatives. So there are a number of items covered in Power Up that expand on topics covered in the energy, buildings, and transportation sector of Plan YC, but provide additional detail on implementation. So if you want to do a deeper dive there are also some technical appendices of some original technical research that the city did to analyze opportunities for things like solar on city-owned properties, in-city wind, which is not a feasible solution. But yeah, you can do a deeper dive there. And then our sister office, the Office of Urban Ag, is actually housed within MOCEJ, and they just put up today a report on their first year. So it's quite a new office. But if you want
agriculture,
urban agriculture. So if you want to learn more about what they've been up to, you can now, as of today, find that on our website.
That's fantastic. Can we open it up to questions, Helen?
Yes, I realize I threw a lot of stuff out there.
I can help you with that, Barbara.
That would be great. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm actually looking through and I see that Valerie was the first one with her hand up. So Valerie, why don't you take it from here?
Thank you. Thank you, Helen, for this wide-ranging presentation. I have two questions, actually. The first one is, I'm trying to understand how this plan is it's a plan. So is it supposed to be something that guides the individual agencies, or how does this get implemented?
Great question. So the process of putting the plan together was I think about a 9-month process. I actually came on board towards the very end of it, but there were interagency convenings. We had a climate cabinet of sort of higher level representatives from agencies as well as external subject matter experts. But it was a long process of getting input and coming to consensus on what commitments, what action items were within the realm of possibility for agencies to commit to, while also really stretching and pushing ourselves to go beyond what we've done before, really think about what are the threats that we're facing and where do we need to go, right? So these initiatives were very much shaped within a consensus building process across agencies. As I mentioned, we have an annual progress report. The first one will be coming out in April. And one of MOCEJ's roles is to coordinate monthly with the project lead. So each action item has a project lead within an agency. We check in with them monthly to see where are they in their progress to goals. Some of them have quantitative targets, some of them have timeline requirements. And so we check in to see how are things going, where are things getting stuck, where are there funding or legislative issues, et cetera. So high priority. We're really fortunate to have a lot of political buy-in from City Hall on following through on these commitments. So it's something that we're really actively, trying to stay on top of and push as a city priority.
Is that something that's available to the public, that you can see what the action items are for the agencies, and then you can also check on the guidelines, or what the plan is?
Yeah, so if you go all the way to the very back of the plan to the appendices, starting on, I think, page 146, it lays out. So actually, before I get there, you can see on at the beginning of the report, pages 10 and 11, there's, I don't know if this all, I'm blurred, but there is a table that lays out across all of the chapters. It's like a cheat sheet of everything at a glance.
Okay.
And then if you turn to that appendix in the very back, you can see, again, that summary, but with these interim milestones. So for every initiative, for every sub-action item, which is about 70 something items, we actually have interim milestones for 2026, unless it's stated that it's even sooner than that, which is the case for some of the action items. So it's all back there, but not until April do we publish.
Okay, I'll put that in my tickler. So my question really revolves around the tree canopy and green spaces. Our community in particular is one of the worst communities in the city in terms of green spaces and parks. So when you're measuring the tree canopy, and I was disappointed that you were actually counting parks as part of the tree canopy, because I'm sure we get a lot of tree canopy coverage as far as Central Park is concerned, and then we drop off considerably. What is the is there a measurement for the tree canopy other than parks and what we have on the Upper East Side?
Yeah, and so I'll give you the answer that I can. I'm happy to also connect you to other folks in my office who focus much more specifically on this. But the data that we have, unfortunately, is only collected on a 5-year cycle. So they do sort of a LiDAR plane aerial survey to see where things are. And that looks across, not only parks area, but then the right-of-way street trees. And so there is a map. It was done in partnership with the Forest for All Coalition and published a couple years ago, but there's an interactive map online where you can see, not very surprising, where there's higher concentrations of canopy coverage versus less. And so part of the Parks Department's strategy in prioritizing where they've been planting new trees is everywhere that they see these major gaps. So that's definitely part of their strategy and their framework for how they prioritize where they're adding street trees in particular. The legislation that just passed a few weeks ago to develop a master plan will look at all area, public, private, across the city, and will be the beginning of a process, which, unfortunately not a most, satisfactory answer, but will be a process going forward to think strategically about how do we work across sectors to get to that 30% goal.
Yeah, it's last thing on the resiliency project downtown on the east side. How do you reconcile resiliency versus loss of trees? Because my understanding is out of 1,000 trees, they lost 700 as part of that resiliency project. So I didn't know, in terms of rebuilding, are they at odds, or?
I know that that's a topic that's come up in other community board meetings and has been a point of controversy. One of my colleagues in this office has been very involved with that. So happy to follow up with her and put you in touch. But what I do know is that as part of the planning for redeveloping the parks along the Lower East Side is, they try to be really, really thoughtful about engaging landscape designers to plant native species, which was not necessarily the case for the trees that had been there. So species that are local to the area, increase biodiversity, but are also somewhat saltwater tolerant, anticipating that there may be some level of inundation that can't be avoided, and making sure that the new plantings takes into account resiliency considerations, and also thinking about them as a buffer and level of absorbency to add to the layer of protection for the community that sits behind. So I think it was an unfortunate trade-off that had to be made in order to raise that whole park to a level that really aligns with what the best science is telling us is the level of risk that we'll be facing. So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer.
No,
I know it was very,
I appreciate
yeah.
that very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate
Yeah.
it. Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody,
Valerie.
for indulging.
Yeah, I'm going to take.
Call on the public first, please. Okay.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thanks.
I'm going to ask Amy to go next, please.
Hi, thank you very much. I think I'm going to just repeat what has been asked. My concern, and I think that Alita and Valerie had mentioned this, was that there is an address to the lack of trees on the Upper East Side. And I know that that's been talked about. We have a paucity of just trees in this area. And my question was, and I think you had answered it, how is that being coordinated with other initiatives underway? So for instance, we know that our city council member, Mark Levine, has really tried to address the Million Tree Initiative. But I like to hear that you are coordinating with initiatives around, and I have a milestone to check in on that. So I'm just repeating that concern.
Yeah, and again, happy to follow up. My colleague Julia Eiferman is really an expert in this area, but I do know that in Plan YC specifically, not only are there the objectives for planting trees, but investing in that the climber pruner tree risk management program is a big effort as well. They've run into, unfortunately, some issues with funding because parks never gets as much funding as they could really use, but trying to think about ways to not only plant new trees, but ensure that the ones we have stay healthy. The quickest way to increase canopy to reach our goals is unfortunately not planting new trees, but to ensure that existing ones can continue to thrive. But there are some of these broader resiliency initiatives. We have a program called Climate Strong Communities. There are some other projects that are looking more broadly at, neighborhood planning, how resiliency issues can work together. And vegetation, landscaping, trees are often part of, the menu of solutions that are being considered. So I don't, have a terrible amount of details to share on that, but I do know that it's certainly something that people are thinking about.
Thank you. Thanks, Helen. The next I'm going to take is Suzanne. Suzanne, can you unmute yourself? Okay.
There we go. Okay, and I'll start my video. Thank you for taking my question. Mine also is concerned with trees. So I walk on the Upper East, I'm on 75th in York, so I walk on the East River Esplanade from where I can begin because there's construction blocking part of it. I get on the 63rd Street overpass bridge, and then I walk into where they have the gardens and near the bridge. And I noticed that there is some progress finally. My first question is, why does the Upper East Side, any project that we have, like the Q train or the Esplanade, it takes years and years and goes beyond the date. I don't believe they're going to finish it next year. It's so slow. I see every day. I keep looking at it, and I went down to where the UN is, and I can see it's never going to connect there. But for the part that's being done, and I realize it's considerable being done right near the 59th Street Bridge, which I'm appreciative of. I want to ask why they plant the trees where they plant them, because in the morning there is no shade there, and there is never seem to be any concern about shading anybody that wants to walk there or do anything in that area, especially near the bridge. There are no plantings that jut out towards the water where the sun is coming from the east side, so we need protection that way. All the plantings are in the dog run, which I don't have a dog, so I don't go in there. And then the new plantings, they had a good idea. They put them in the middle to kind of divide the bike pathway from the pedestrian pathway. But they really need to be more east, than they put them. And I don't understand, did they not even visit this area?
Suzanne, I'm going to say we have a parks committee. I don't think the parks chairs have been on there, but can we bring this to the parks committee? And they work with the Esplanade almost every meeting. There's something about the Esplanade. I know that they did tremendous designing with it and so on. But I don't know, Helen, unless you have an answer.
I unfortunately do not. So yeah, I would defer to Parks on that.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. I'm going to make sure that the Parks chair know that that there was questions about it, and possibly look at the agendas of the Parks Committee to see. But thank you for the question.
Maybe Suzanne, if you can put in your email in the chat, then they can follow up. The next I'm going to take is Abraham.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sahar. So appreciate, Helen, the presentation. Really loved it. I wanted to focus a little bit more, just maybe if you can speak to us, because I was very excited to see about the CHPE transmission line, because I think as we are transitioning, to clean, as we're getting away from fossil fuels and everything's going more to electric, electric vehicles means more charging stations, more demands on the grid. So I'm always concerned about making sure that our energy grid is resilient and updated and modern. And us being New York City, obviously we're dependent on the state. So if you can talk a little bit more about what the city is doing to help with the infrastructure and how the interplay is with the state and city, I think that would be just great to hear.
Yeah, so I will preface it by saying that is a major topic in our Power Up report. So would encourage you to check that out for more details. And actually one of the technical appendices that we worked with researchers on was looking at the interplay between electrification of our buildings and transportation systems and grid capacity. And Con Edison, the utilities, that's very much what their business is. So they've been doing their own studies, and we're in conversation with them to identify where there might be choke points and try to make sure that we're planning for that. But yeah, so there is we call it CHIPPY, the Champlain Hudson Express, which will be a major transmission line to carry hydropower down from Quebec. So that is moving forward, although I don't know how keyed in you are to recent developments in the last week or two with the Public Service Commission, where there were, I think, 3 major offshore wind development projects which had been approved to be sited within what's called the New York Bight. So it's sort of this triangular area off the coast of the city and then towards the continental shelf. They'd negotiated those contracts before COVID and came back and asked for more money, and the PSC said no. So those wind projects had been anticipated to provide a large amount of renewable energy capacity, also developing transmission lines to bring those onshore. So we're at a point where we're waiting to see how things might shake out with negotiations, but the capacity from offshore wind generation is a huge part of that plan. And then also moving forward with the CHIPPY transmission line. So that's already gone through a siting process. I'm not sure what the latest updates are, but capacity of the grid in reliability is 1,000% top of mind issue as we evaluate the, transition to electric systems. So check out Power Up if you want more. And then, yeah, feel free to follow up and I can put you in touch with other coworkers who focus on that.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I think we have about 20 more meetings we have to have on each.
There's a lot. There is a lot in there, which makes it really exciting and
We're
also
talk about trees.
challenging. Yeah.
Thanks, Helen. And also to understand everything, because these are very technical details as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Next, I will take Alida, and then I have a question or two.
And I have questions also.
And I think Mark was here too. So let's do Alida first. Yeah.
Thank you. And first, I just want to apologize for having interrupted the flow earlier. But thank you. And sorry again about the camera. I'm a little bit nauseous, but not about this. Third, I have a few questions. One is, did I miss something? There is so much information about the negative environmental impact of both the construction of tall buildings and the demolition of buildings. Demolition releases, unbeknownst to many, an enormous amount of stored up carbon into the atmosphere. So how does the plan deal with that? Because New York is a never-ending pod of construction, but there could actually be some controls on the use of old facades, the use of old buildings as the bottom levels of new construction, limiting height and doing things like that. We're so congested here, but this certainly could apply citywide. Second, as co-chair of the Small Business Committee, I'm wondering if if I've missed this, I do apologize, are any provisions, and it might be worth having a small business meeting about this. Are there any provisions in the plan to actually help small businesses to fund, let's say, air conditioning, because no one wants to go into a hot and humid store in the summer or a cold one in the winter, or to help them retrofit anything, to help them change the way goods are delivered? And I noticed in the plan you said to have every New Yorker have access to a bike or a scooter. Not everyone wants to be on a bike or a scooter, and much less people necessarily making deliveries or store owners commuting long distances because they can't afford the rent in our neighborhood, but we would love to have them have a small business in one of our very many vacant storefronts. So I'm just wondering about all of those, and I appreciate your consideration. There was something else, but I've already forgotten what it is. And thank you very much for being here as well.
Go, Alida.
Yeah, of course. So I'll try to speak to a couple of those as best I can. So regarding embodied carbon of construction materials, that is increasingly a focus of, it's sort of the next phase of where the city is trying to go in terms of regulations. We recently passed an executive order that requires a new construction low carbon concrete. And so that will impact city capital agencies' specifications for what that means. But thinking about in the context of new construction, what that means. The majority of our buildings are not being demolished. They are being retrofit. Doesn't mean that there aren't significant waste streams associated with that, but we do actually include in Plan YC commitments for expanding. I think the city currently has only one asphalt recycling plant, but we have commitments related to working with the private sector to expand programs like that. And then I actually don't know the details of it, but there is a program called, Construct NYC, which I believe looks at not only material use, but also decarbonizing all of the machinery, right? Like all of the equipment that's running all day long while buildings are being worked on, and switching to all electric equipment for that. So, I think absolutely a big area that we need to grapple with, but I think embodied carbon is increasingly becoming a focus, and in the city expanding its greenhouse gas inventory to what we're calling consumption-based, that begins to address some of those questions. So not nearly enough, but I think starting to grapple with those. Regarding transportation, the idea is not for everybody to have to use those, multimodal transportation, but to ensure that there's access. So I forget the mileage distance, but making sure that nobody is more than, say, a 10-minute walk from, bike share, bike docking, scooter share programs, et cetera, that we continue to expand our protected bike lanes and make sure that they're built to allow for various, forms of transit, of multimodal transit, but completely understood that, this is an issue with transit deserts, right? Many people do have to commute, which is why if you refer to Power Up, that's where we really focus on acknowledging that, right? That many people will continue to need to drive. We have real freight issues we need to grapple with, increasing amounts of Amazon delivery, last mile, et cetera. And so how do we balance those needs of people who need to get around by cars with, air quality, emissions, et cetera, and some of the challenges that go with that. So that's where we're really focusing on expanding access to EV charging infrastructure, have just passed some requirements for all licensed for hire vehicles to go all electric by 2030 or be ADA accessible as sort of a caveat. Also electrifying all city fleets, aside from fire trucks, which have some sort of capacity challenges with the current technology, city school buses. So there are many other initiatives beyond what's in Plan YC related to advancing electric vehicles. And I don't remember your other question, sorry.
About small business, whether there is any incentive or subsidies for small businesses who may want to retrofit their shops to the extent they can to comply with environmental or better than environmental standards. And also, I did remember my other question, which is whether there's an incentive or requirement that New York City, and I don't know whether there is, and so I'm a little embarrassed, to buy local. Manhole covers are made in India, I believe, for instance, and if it helps, if businesses get their goods from local manufacturers, it improves jobs, it increases manufacturing in the area, and it removes dependency upon other economies, for instance.
That is a great point. I do not know the answer. Tangential to that, I would add that I know the Office of Contract Services, they put out the environmentally preferable purchasing requirements, which all city agencies doing, purchasing from office supplies to major equipment. It enumerates a number of requirements for, standards that they have to meet for what's considered environmentally preferable. I don't believe it has any requirements related to where it's purchased from, but I think the consumption-based emissions inventory might be an interesting mechanism by which we begin to baseline where are we today across purchasing sort of what's scope 3 emissions. So I don't know whether we're doing anything there yet, but beginning to hopefully collect the data that can show us how far we need to go.
Thank you. And since construction firms, some of them anyway, are small businesses, and there is a lot of construction, whether it's retrofitting or new building, is there any provision to help them use local manufacturers or local sources? Because again, trucks are heavy contributors to environmental emissions, and those kinds of other thinking can really help make an impact on what is happening in the city and its environment.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So I realize you asked also about incentives or support for small business owners. That is something also within the local Law 97 sort of mobilization initiative that we're now undertaking as the law comes into compliance starting next year. We, being MOCEJ, along with utility, state, other agency partners, are really trying to figure out creative incentives, tax abatements that can support all types of building owners, including small business owners. So certainly those who are, least the large real estate developers, say like the Vornados and Tishman Spires of the world, have much more resources, obviously, to figure out, to pay for these upgrades, but really thinking about how we can concentrate and prioritize city resources on supporting the, like Class B and C office buildings, small businesses, small homeowners. So I don't know exactly what's in place now, but that's going to be a huge push over the coming months and years. And then I forget what the last piece of that was.
So did I.
Okay.
But thank
it.
you. And it's also
Thank
because
you.
small businesses are unlikely to be in new construction. They can't afford the
Yeah.
rent, and the spaces are too
Right.
large. So if there were a program to help them put in a heat pump, for instance, instead of an air conditioner in the transom over the entrance
Right.
door,
Right.
that could make a big difference. But that's an
Okay.
expense that many may not be equipped to foot themselves. So
Right.
thank you very much. Sorry
Yeah,
for
you're welcome.
hogging all of your time
No,
and
no
covering so
worries.
many bases, but I really appreciate it.
In our
Thank you.
community, Alita, we have a huge amount of destruction of buildings and rebuilding of it. There isn't a block that you can go by when there's a huge project going on.
No, thank you so much for answering all the questions, Helen. And now we will just take Marco. Marco, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
Thank you. Let me start saying that I'm an expert in sustainable buildings and certified by FEMA and in resilient in the resilient communities. This is a very ambitious plan. I can go in different direction because it's very hard to reach, but I'm going to go for what I consider is the most important part, local law 97, which is required by 2030, 40% of reduction, and by 2050, 80. And then we have the local law 2014 to 2021, which is required by 2040, all buildings must be electrical. So I was a couple of weeks, I was in training on DOB, and they told us that the capacity of the grid, of Connect grid, is just only 40%. If you have 40% of the extra to satisfy or to supply the electricity, basically we're in serious trouble, because most of the buildings, the main issue is to reduce the energy loads. If you reduce the energy loads, yes, we are in fine position. But now the issue is, because it's very confusing, because it's a new issue for many buildings. Now, several buildings, they are preparing a lawsuit against the city because this is not the way that has to be handled, and that's basically the whole program is in disarray now, because if they put so many lawsuits, so many impediments to go try to achieve something that I believe is that's the way that should be. But so how do you try to ameliorate these lawsuits between the buildings? And that's especially in our community. Most of our community have buildings of more than 25,000 square feet. That's the target. So how are we going to try to figure it out to probably to extend the limits? I don't know, have no idea. But what I perceive, I don't think you're going to be successful in the main issue of the reduction of carbon emissions.
Helen?
Yeah, these are very, very fair questions. Regarding lawsuits, that's not something our office is really involved in. That's really more DOB that unfortunately has to confront that. But from the first round of rulemaking through the second round that was just released, we heard from folks on both ends saying the law needs to be weakened because it's unfair. The law isn't strong enough to get to where we need to go. So I think the process of revising for the second rulemaking package really tried to incorporate and find solutions that both advance our carbon reduction goals, get us to carbon neutrality by 2050, which we are very committed to, while trying to address stakeholder concerns. And so part of that, and again, you can check out the Local Law 97 report on our website, but for the first compliance period starting next year, it's actually only about 30% of covered buildings, so those 25,000 square feet and up, that will be required to comply. And so some of those, are where there's still like a lot of low-hanging fruit for efficiency improvements. And, as you noted, if we're addressing comprehensive efficiency improvements while in parallel to electrifying, we drive down use first, then we install highly efficient equipment, it's not necessarily going to lead to huge jumps in electricity consumption, right? But we're also, through things like the City of VS text amendments, trying to reduce barriers for battery storage technology that, in combination with more community-based, city-sided solar, will be able to have more grid balancing potential there. And so in 2030, that is when the local law 97 compliance requirements become much more stringent. So those levels, emissions caps, get much tighter. That's when the majority of buildings will have to comply. And so the emissions reduction benefits in that phase will be much more substantial. We're really trying to create programs and structures to get building owners to start thinking today about long-term capital planning for 2030, because it'll come around before they know. And that's why the accelerator program, which is going through a refresh, is really trying to think through how to provide support services to help building owners get to where they need to go by 2030. And the one other piece that I'll add is, even for folks who, starting next year, will need to comply, that's sort of 30% of buildings, the recent rule update allows for basically a 2-year, not an extension with no consequences, but if a building is out of compliance, acknowledging significant financial difficulties, sometimes a lot of buildings have deferred maintenance, like structural safety, mold, asbestos remediation that they need to address first. If they're able to show a good faith effort to get towards their compliance goals and eventually meet them by 2030, which is, again, the more stringent, then they will not receive the civil penalties for those 2 years. But if they do not show that good faith effort, or actually then implement some of the things that are required, then they will retroactively receive those civil penalties. So I think the second rules making package, nothing's ever going to be perfect, but I think really try to think through what some of the challenges are to different types of building owners, different asset types, and come up with hopefully some pathways that have some flexibility. So again, I'm not the expert in my office on that topic, but feel free to follow up, and then also check out that local law 97
I'm going to
document on our
make
website.
one more comment. It is true that right now they try to go for the benchmarking, and the benchmarking, as per DOV said in the training, that they know that the numbers that they put in benchmarking are wrong. So that means they have serious challenge to face ahead. I mean, I would like to support the idea. It means I believe in the global warming. Don't get me wrong, but the question is, how are you going to reach that part because we are unprepared, and the buildings, they claim that there are no enough income to do this kind of the alterations to improve, and indeed it will be very expensive. Yes, Department of City Planning, they did something nice. They increased the floor area. They give an angle for the solar panels.
Marco, we've talked about local law 97, and I think that Helen said we could readdress it again, but it is getting very late, and I have questions, Sahar has questions, and I understand what you're saying, but I think Helen does too, and the city is working on it. I know that these questions have been asked before, if you don't mind. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I just, in general, if Robert or someone else is able to maybe aggregate if there is a list of folks who would like to follow up, and then I can help direct people
we can have another meeting on local law. I mean, it's unending.
Yeah, and that would really be DOB to take the lead.
Right. Sahar, are you?
No, you go ahead. I think you asked a question.
Okay, I have a few questions. First of all, in terms of heat, we once had a very interesting meeting on Roosevelt Island, the Cornell Tech buildings that had a passive house that really talked a lot more about insulation and changing windows that can make a tremendous amount. Are you addressing that also rather than just the air conditioning? It evidently made tremendous difference in the heating and cooling.
Yes, and I love that you brought that up because that really is I think central to the messaging that we're trying to get out in terms of technical guidance. I know the accelerator has been working with a number of, industry groups, architects, engineers to try to institutionalize things like passive house as a best practice, whether or not a building is going for that certification or following those principles more broadly. And so, yeah, the principles behind that really look at addressing the building envelope first, which is, the walls, the roofs, improving insulation, air sealing, air tightness, making sure that heat isn't leaking out. That also improves indoor air quality when you're pairing it with a good ventilation system. Using energy recovery ventilation is another, key piece of that as well. So yes, that is absolutely part of the thinking of sort of a larger paradigm shift that the industry needs to go through. And so that's a balance of
electricity can make the electricity late.
Yeah, I've heard things like you could, like in an apartment, you could heat your apartment with the energy equivalent to like a hair dryer, because then you've got the heat that we give off. You've got these great windows that are capturing heat in the winter, keeping heat out in the summer.
They actually had steady heat, the summer and winter. They had steady heat.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. They also talked, and I can't remember the word, I'm blank, going down ground level, what is it called? Getting water that heated the water that caused much less electricity to cool and heat water when it came from ground, and you need very little space with it. I gather St. Patrick's has used it in a small little plot of land. So that was another thing.
Yeah, so there are a number of different heat pump technologies, ones that pull from air, ones that pull from water, ground source. And so a lot of what the city has been focusing on, and I think we're really starting to hit momentum, is working with technology providers, actually working with countries in Europe and Asia that have been way ahead of the game compared to us, to do some technology transfer, case studies. So really trying to accelerate the market transformation,
possibly with funding along the way. We do need, Marco's absolutely right. Things are very expensive. I've been obsessed with something called rain gardens because of something. Is there something specific with rain garden? Is it in a specific place? Is there specific plantings? And yes.
And the level of detail I know about that. So DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, they're the ones who are responsible for wastewater, drinking water, stormwater management. So they manage those rain gardens. The plantings are meant to be flood tolerant, both drought resistant and flood tolerant. They're often sited in areas that are known to experience chronic stormwater flooding to help to, reduce the flows to the stormwater systems, areas where there might be CSO, the combined sewer overflow, where you get our wastewater and the stormwater mixing together and then flowing out into our water bodies. So I don't know too much of the details of how they select those locations, but it's
part of we'll do something, and this will be perfect. I was just thinking, the one I know right near me does have it's very high grasses and so on. And if that is good, I'm wondering if we can then ask buildings around their tree pits to plant certain, rather than daffodils or whatever they plant, to put special that could help with flood water.
I love that idea. I don't know if it's already in place, but maybe as part of this,
the
master plan for tree coverage, maybe, that could be an opportunity there.
And sewers is this huge topic. I know you talked, but when this proposal we have, is that something we should all be voting yes on? It's something with like funding sewers or something? I don't.
I'd need more
Government?
information on
Okay,
exactly
never
what
mind.
that is.
I
Yeah.
think we should all vote yes, is what I was told, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, the commissioner of DEP, he's come out and said, the climate is changing faster than our infrastructure can change. Unfortunately, right? We've got sewer systems, wastewater systems that are stormwater systems that are over 100 years old at this point. So I do know that recently DEP completed extensive digital mapping of basically all storm water drainage basins, areas with chronic flooding, to determine how to prioritize where to put in additional stormwater mitigation infrastructure, whether that's larger drainage basins or things like green infrastructure like rain gardens, because it's not always, it might be that the problem is uphill from where you're actually seeing that flooding. And so trying to, now we're at a place where we have this bigger picture and can begin to be much more strategic about where we're investing money to, try to solve for where we're seeing repetitive flooding damage.
I've taken more notes, but I think you answered most of them. And I just see like 20 more meetings coming out of each one as an individual. And I didn't mean to cut Marco off, except I know it's getting late and we don't want to use more of your time. Is there anything, very often at meetings, we have resolutions to say we want to support. Is this something that you would want us to say we support Plan NYC, or is it done and it's not necessary?
It's
we don't need more work than we need.
Yeah, that's done. It's already, been approved by City Council. I had put in the chat, I actually didn't come through as links, but there is a link, this Take Action link that they often post opportunities to,
Yeah.
Also, the City Hall has their own, they actually have this contact the mayor page. You can text him. Who that actually goes to, I don't know. And then there's a volunteering page as well. So I think those are more, kind of hands-on opportunities. But there's nothing at this moment in time to, resolution-wise.
Are
but
you
I appreciate
on the Department of Environment?
No. So confusingly enough, city budgets, my position is paid for by the Department of Environmental Protection. But our office, MOCEJ, is technically part of City Hall of the mayor's office. Yeah. So we're not an agency. We're our own little entity.
Oh, that's very interesting. I thought it was Thank you. Are there any other questions or?
No, there are no.
Addison, is there anything?
I just wanted to thank you so much, Helen, for stopping by today. This was super helpful for me, and I'm sure the rest of the committee. And so we just really thank you for your time and willingness to share your wealth of knowledge with us.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. I do hope it was helpful. I know
there's it's
a lot more. Yeah, there's a lot to dig into, and I'm certainly not the expert on all of these topic areas. But as I mentioned, I don't know if Robert, you might be the best, or you can share my email. But if folks want to get in touch, and I can see how to follow up as best I can, and either putting you in touch with a contact or a website where you can find the resources that would be most helpful.
I think that we're going to talk about with other committees like the Parks Committee, the Small Business Committee, and so on. Transportation. One more thing. I did have one more question.
Yeah.
I forget if it was Plan NYC or City of Yes. There was talk about new pavement that would absorb the water to repave. I don't know if it's our sidewalks or streets. That could be pretty amazing.
Yeah, so I actually didn't even get into this whole other side project. So I manage, we have a climate resiliency design guideline pilot mandated under local law. It's a 5-year pilot. At the end of 2026, we'll be publishing these guidelines, which will apply for city-owned projects. So any agency that does any kind of capital project over sort of a certain threshold, It could be all asset types from public buildings to things like sidewalks, landscapes. They need to go through a process of evaluating what's the expected end of useful life of that asset, then looking at climate science projections for heat, extreme precipitation, sea level rise, what design specifications should they be meeting in order to address those risks. And then they need to incorporate that into the design of that asset. And one of the solutions for precipitation risk abatement is use of porous pavements in the design.
That's amazing.
So yeah, so lots going on different fronts.
And you also talked about different cement using it for it. So
yeah. So, you know,
let's do it soon. We need it soon.
I know. There's a lot to do
Work
and running out of time to do it. But yeah, lots
Thank
of great folks.
So much. I think
hard.
we all appreciate it, Sahar. I think all of us have done it, and we will be in touch, Helen. Thank you so much.
So glad. Thank you for having me.
For putting us in touch with you.
Yeah, thank you, Helen, and thank you everyone for joining today.
Yes.
All right. Thanks, everyone.